You alright, huh?
Mr. Speaker, before I go on to analyze what exactly is the purpose of the UN and how important it is for the UN to make decisions as a whole, basically I have two main points of contention inside on this case. Firstly, is with their whole policy of having the Secretary General, basically the spokesperson of the UN, not the guy that's making the decisions, basically be the one who is just the only one recognizing the occurrence of genocide and forcing the Security Council to act on it. Essentially, it's behind the reasons for implementing their policy, basically the apparent ineffectiveness of the UN and providing some form of deterrence for future cases of genocide. But firstly, let's look at their policy, because we must question why would actually the Secretary General be making these decisions that could possibly go against the interests of these member nations, especially when the Secretary General is firstly nominated by the Security Council beforehand. We think that the Secretary General, because if he is the only one making decisions for UN, he would pander to the interests of the Security Council in order to maybe even get elected for a second term, because the Security Council is the one having these nominations for the Secretary General before he's elected by the General Assembly. So we think it would be ineffective in that sense if you are leaving the decision-making power to that one person who could possibly just pander to the interest of just the member nation of the Security Council. And secondly, why would the Security Council actually be obligated to intervene? We think that the Security Council holds its rights of being able to veto any decision as something that's very important and is basically an inherent right as a member of the Security Council. We don't think that they would want their rights to be able to veto any decision to be compromised in that sense. Now, on the second main point of the whole inefficiency of the UN, we think that the UN in itself, why people say it is inefficient is because it respects the sovereignty of the nations and it holds true to its principles. We think that that is something that should not be compromised in that sense, because even if the UN cannot invade, there are other organizations that could possibly, for example NATO, for example the US-led allied forces, when they recognize genocide, they can go in and intervene. We think that the UN as a global body having member nations should not compromise its principles of respecting the sovereignty of its people, of its member nations, as well as having decisions made by its member nations, not just by one individual person. And of course, on the last point of that level of deterrence, really we don't think that really crazy governments who do carry out genocide would really be afraid of any repercussions, because they are basically crazy enough to start the genocide in the first place. So we don't think that what idea of deterrence really stands. Now, we must recognize that we must see that nature of the UN is essentially a global body that consists of many member nations, all of who have a voice, and that is why they joined in the UN in the first place. And we think that that voice, that decision-making power, should be respected. Now, while my second speaker will be analyzing the importance of global decisions, not just a one-man show, I would be speaking about the nature of the UN as primarily a peacekeeping force, and secondly, how it always respects that sovereignty of a nation. Because firstly, we must see that it's intervening in other countries is not just the purpose of the UN. The UN does not ever intervene in any conflict. What the UN is, it's a global body that has that legitimacy to basically urge countries to a change, to try and persuade them to a change. That's why they don't have a fully functioning military that invades any sign of conflict, because it has already agreed to not be actively involved in any of these conflicts. Because especially when it tries to be involved in any war, it leads to a conflict of interest amongst member nations, especially of the Security Council. And that is why we have that power, that veto power, to make sure everyone comes to a consensus before making a proper decision. So, before I go on, yes.
We think that one of the primary roles of the UN is to protect human rights as well as to maintain peace. And we think that in the form of genocide, it is crucial for the UN to step in there, because they have to uphold peace and security as well as human rights.
Now, it isn't I think you have this misguided assumption that the UN should just intervene in any kind of conflict, because if you just talk about genocide, you haven't actually identified why genocide is such a special case that the UN should be intervening. If you follow your line of logic, basically when there's any any conflict between two member nations, and when it leads to a large-scale war, then again to uphold the security and uphold, basically protect people and their human rights from being violated, they should intervene in any single war that happens on a global scale. So we don't think that is the purpose of the UN, and especially that's the purpose of the peacekeeping forces, because that peacekeeping force is established primarily for humanitarian reasons. Firstly, for example, to distribute aid in events of disaster and whatnot. Or another example is to facilitate the reconstruction of any country. And of course, is to protect its own aid volunteers. It isn't a fully functioning military to go in and invade and destroy that whole idea of respecting the sovereignty of nations. So secondly, why is the sovereignty so important? Because especially when the UN essentially is composed of a global body with many member nations, we must recognize the legitimacy of the government of each of these member nations. That is why it does not just intervene and does not dictate whatever these countries say or do. And we think that especially when you realize that sovereignty is always something that has been upheld in the UN, and it basically relies on other countries, for example, the US to go in and invade. For example, when the US first wanted to invade Iraq, they tried to get suspicion of weapons of mass destruction. They think that even though there is a possible threat, they still would respect their sovereignty. So even though there may be human rights abuses, there may be basically it's effect of the UN. That's why Ban Ki-moon essentially only can urge countries to change. For example, with Myanmar, they only can urge Myanmar to release Aung San Suu Kyi. They only can urge Myanmar to accept international aid. Even though that person is a credible person with a lot of experience, he basically is the role to go into countries and try and effect change. And even if that person has opinions, he shouldn't be responsible for decision of the world. We cannot put that pressure on just that one person. Even the most powerful man on earth, Barack Obama, doesn't have the ability to make decisions for the group. And that's why we think is that it's important to have these global decisions, and that's why this motion must fall.